The son abandoned his elderly mother in an unfamiliar city to die. But something unimaginable happened at the first light of dawn. Hello, don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment below. Enjoy the story. Mrs. Rose felt the gentle invasion of the sun in her room, sliding through the curtains of the old window. It was a special day, one of those days when she would go to the market and prepare a delicious lunch for her beloved grandchildren, Luke and Thomas. They were the children of Martin, Mrs. Rose's only son. Martin, in particular, was living through difficult days. At 43, with a respectable career in agronomy and a solid academic background, he was looking for work. The global crisis spared no one, and he still hadn't found a new job. His life had drastically changed since the death of his wife, Laura. In the desperate search for a cure for her, Martin had spent a lot of money and time, resulting in a sea of debts. Mrs. Rose, always loving and dedicated, did what she could to help. She lent her son the money she had painstakingly saved over the years. At 75, she did not shirk her responsibilities and continued to work hard. Mrs. Rose cleaned and ironed clothes at the home of the Johnsons, a wealthy executive couple in the city. That day, upon arriving at work, Mr. John Johnson surprised her. Looking into her eyes, he said, "Rose, today marks 35 years since you started working with us. This is very significant, not just for me, but also for Mary, my wife. That's why we want to offer you retirement for your long service. We know how hard you've worked and are aware of the difficulties you face. Please accept our offer." Mrs. Rose, with the wisdom of someone who has lived a lot, replied, "Sir, I don't want to retire just yet. Here you pay much more than I would receive if I retired. I am very grateful, but for now, I prefer to stay as I am." The boss did not insist further and thanked her for the long years of dedicated service. Another day, while cleaning the quiet halls of the mansion, Mrs. Rose overheard a conversation in the distance. It was Mrs. Mary and Julia talking about Julia's wedding to Leo, Mary, and John's son. Mrs. Rose, unintentionally, heard rumors that Leo was unfaithful. Another employer even commented that Leo had touched her without permission. 2 weeks later, on a quiet afternoon at her home, Mrs. Rose received a call. "Hello, who is it?" she asked. "Hello, Mrs. Rose, it's me, Julia. Please come to my future mother-in-law's mansion. I need to talk to you urgently." "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Mrs. Rose replied, concerned. Upon arriving at the mansion, she found Julia crying. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Rose. I discovered the truth about my husband. He came home yesterday with lipstick on his shirt and smelling of women's perfume. He said it was my lipstick and my perfume, but I know it's a lie." Julia looked at Mrs. Rose with hope. "Mrs. Rose, you have worked here for so many years, you saw my husband grow up. By any chance, do you know anything about him and the cleaning lady?" Mrs. Rose sighed. "Look, Julia, I've worked in this house for over 40 years. I saw your husband grow up, graduate, and start working. But over the years, I also noticed that he is not very faithful. I never commented on this before because it's not my business. I'm just the cleaner, I shouldn't interfere in these matters. But, you know, my conscience weighs on me. This week, I discovered something that worried me. A coworker who is very close to your husband told me they are having an affair. Another coworker also told me that Leo harassed another employee and that she did not report it out of fear of losing her job." Mrs. Rose paused, looking at Julia with empathy. "I know it's hard to hear this, Julia. I am a woman who has been through many things in life. Nothing surprises me anymore, but I can see how you must be feeling. If I were in your place, I would hire a private detective to uncover the truth. Go home, pretend you know nothing. Hire a detective and discover his true intentions." Julia, still processing the words, responded almost automatically, I forgot to mention, Mrs. Rose. Leo asked me to take a vacation and go to the coast, saying he would take care of my business while I was away. I found that request strange. Mrs. Rose smiled slightly and left. Julia, now alone, reflected on her life. She was a successful woman who started from scratch. First, she opened a small women's clothing store, which over time turned into several branches. She became one of the richest women in the country, but recently she had been suffering from constant stomach pains. After several consultations, the doctors still had not found the cause of the problem. As a precaution, the doctor in charge of the case decided to send her to an oncologist, as he had identified something concerning in her stomach. Mrs. Julia, we are sending you to a specialized hospital for further tests. There, they will almost certainly discover if you really have a malignant tumor, said the doctor. Hearing the words, malignant tumor, Julia shuddered. Tears began to run down her face, and she stammered, but doctor, I'm too young to die. I'm only 27 years old. The doctor, trying to reassure her, replied, calm down, Mrs. Julia. Even I could not distinguish your case clearly. Go to the hospital, do the tests. Even if it is a malignant tumor, medicine has advanced a lot. There are treatments and techniques that can help. Julia, still shaken, thanked the doctor, took the order for the tests, and left murmuring a trembling, thank you very much. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Martin, Mrs. Rose's son, who had already lost hope of finding a job, came home with encouraging news. He had gotten a job as an agronomist on a distant farm. Mom, my prayers were answered. I got a job on a farm 2 days away from here. I need money to travel. Could you lend it to me? I will pay you back as soon as I receive my first salary, he said with a smile. Mrs. Rose, though happy for her son's achievement, was worried about the request. Martin, my son, I don't have that money now, but I will get it for you tomorrow when I return from work. Congratulations on your achievement, she replied lovingly. Martin thanked her and left, leaving his mother deep in thought. That night, as she was about to sleep, Mrs. Rose felt a bad premonition. Restless, she got up to drink water, trying to calm her mind. To her surprise, upon reaching the kitchen, she found Martin talking to an unknown woman. Martin, unaware of his mother's presence, said to the woman, "Love, don't worry. My mother, that old fool, will get me the money. Then we'll think about how to get rid of her. We won't have to pay her back." The woman replied coldly, "I hope that old woman gets the money. If not, besides leaving you, I'll tell everything. That you never went to look for a job and that you killed your ex-wife to keep her life insurance." Mrs. Rose, hidden, heard everything in horror. She couldn't believe that her own son was a criminal and an opportunist. Trembling, she ran back to bed, tormented by the decision she had to make, to turn her son into the police or not. After all, she was his mother. But how could she accept such an atrocity? The next morning, the situation became even more complicated. Julia, an acquaintance of Mrs. Rose, called with alarming news. She had cancer and needed help. "Mrs. Rose, I need you to help me with my business," said Julia. "I know you can't read, but your experience is valuable. I don't require higher education, just your experience. When can you start?" Mrs. Rose, still affected by the events of the previous night, agreed to start the day after tomorrow at 7 a.m. Julia promised that Peter would help her with the necessary equipment. "Mrs. Rose, take care. You are a woman of good heart, and God does not abandon those who trust in Him," said Julia, grateful. Mrs. Rose, with a heavy heart, thanked Julia's words, still struggling with the decision she had to make about her son. Hanging up the phone, with her mind full of thoughts, she remembered the conversation she had overheard between her son Martin and the mysterious woman. She knew she had to act, but a mother's love tormented her. She wanted justice, but at the same time, it was her son. After hours of reflection, she decided to go to her employer's house to clarify her situation. Upon arriving there, she was greeted by Mr. John, who said with regret, "Good morning, Rose. I'm sorry to inform you, but we are on the brink of bankruptcy. We don't want to leave you helpless, so we will pay you for your time of service. Unfortunately, you will no longer need to work here." Surprised, Mrs. Rose recalled, "But Mr. John, you offered me retirement some time ago, and I didn't accept it, thinking that your financial situation was not bad." John sighed, "You refused retirement despite having worked additional years. Now, as I said, we will pay you for your time of service, and you will no longer need to come." Mrs. Rose, though sad, responded with gratitude, "I understand, Mr. John. I could pursue my rights, but I know you have always been honest and kind to me. Thank you for all the years of work and support." Leaving her employer's house, Mrs. Rose reflected on her new journey in Julia's company, trying to console herself. At home, she talked to Martin, telling him about losing her job and the postponement of the promised loan. "My son, I don't feel well. I'm going to rest. I feel a lump in my throat. I thought I would work a little longer for Mr. John, but I was wrong." She kept to herself the news of the new job with Julia, distrusting even her own son. Martin, oblivious to his mother's thoughts, only asked, "That's fine, Mom. Lend me the money, and I'll pay you back when I get my salary." Mrs. Rose, knowing Martin's hidden plan, felt even more anguished, hiding her knowledge about his true intentions. That night, Mrs. Rose felt the weight of the years more than ever. The sharp pain in her chest kept her in bed, immobile and alone. The morning light brought Julia's concern, who, not receiving a response to her numerous calls, sensed something was wrong. Worried, Julia knew Mrs. Rose was essential to take care of the business during her absence. Running to Mrs. Rose's house, Julia found the lady in a grave condition. Quickly and carefully, she administered first aid and called an ambulance. At the hospital, the doctors diagnosed a myocardial infarction and informed that urgent surgery was needed. Julia, who saw in Mrs. Rose the reflection of the mother she had lost 2 years ago, followed everything closely, flooded by a mix of affection and concern. The doctors informed Julia that due to the heart attack, Mrs. Rose might suffer memory loss. This deeply disturbed her, as besides her own fight against cancer, Mrs. Rose was her only trust to take care of the business since her husband Leo was not an option. Exhausted, Julia returned home, only to be greeted by Leo's shouts. He was furious because she had reduced the limit on the card they shared after discovering a possible infidelity. Leo's harsh and unfair words deeply hurt Julia. He accused her of ingratitude, complaining about having to endure her illness, about taking care of her. But Julia, despite the tears, knew she needed to be strong, both for herself and for Mrs. Rose, who was fighting for her life in the hospital. Julia, disturbed, went to her room, where she cried for a few minutes, but pulled herself together, determined to be strong, both for herself and for Mrs. Rose, who was fighting for her life in the hospital. Determined, she thought, "I will get through this soon. Leo will regret it. Who does he think he is to talk to me that way?" Just as she finished composing herself, Leo appeared at the room's door. He brought a tray with food and medicine. With a look of remorse, he said to Julia, "My love, forgive me. I know it's hard for you and for me too, being without money. After taking care of you, sometimes I go out with my friends and have a beer. That makes me come home late, but you must know that you are the only one I truly love. Forgive me." Despite his words, Julia was not fooled. She knew he was lying. It was no wonder that Leo's parents had cut off the generous allowance he received. Leo didn't like to work, he was a womanizer and lazy. Later that same day, Julia called Martin and told him about his mother's condition, who had suddenly fallen ill and then suffered a heart attack. He pretended to be sad. However, in his mind, he was already planning something terrible, to go to the hospital and ask the doctors to disconnect the machines that kept his mother alive. Then, he took the hospital's address from Julia and headed there. It had been a week since Mrs. Rose was considered practically dead. However, now she was reacting. So, Martin, fearing that his mother would recover, decided to go to the hospital to talk to the doctor. Hello, doctor. Are you the doctor in charge of my mother, Mrs. Rose? Yes, I'm Dr. Samuel Moore. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you too, doctor. I'm Martin. I came to talk about one of my mother's last wishes. She asked me, in case she reached a state like the one she's in now, to authorize the disconnection of the machines that keep her alive. My mother was always a lively woman, and I'm sure if she could, she would choose to leave in peace. Samuel looked at Martin, surprised by his request. Calm down, young man. We have protocols to follow. I can't just disconnect your mother's machines without being sure she will resist and come out of the coma. She has little brain activity, yes, but we need more evaluations before making any decision. In the room, Mrs. Rose lay motionless, surrounded by machines and tubes. Martin looked at her, feeling a mix of fear and desperation. The doctor, still shocked by the strange request Martin had made, decided to call Julia. Hello, Julia. This is Samuel Moore. Mrs. Rose's son, Martin, was here. He asked me to disconnect his mother's machines, saying she had suggested it earlier, but I can't authorize that. Although I know about her low brain activity, other doctors need to evaluate the situation before making any decision. This can only be a bad joke, said Julia, not believing what she was hearing. How can a son ask that? Doesn't he love his own mother, she added. Then, Dr. Samuel affirmed, no, I will not disconnect the machines. I will keep Mrs. Rose alive. Please come and see her. I will be there tonight, doctor. Any news, I will let you know, replied Julia while hanging up the phone. Just as she hung up the phone, it rang again. Mrs. Julia, come to the hospital. Something incredible has happened. Come quickly. The call ended abruptly. Upon arriving at the hospital, Julia was nervous, expecting the worst. The doctor greeted her with surprising news. Mrs. Rose had just uttered her name. Go to her room, said the doctor. Julia, excited, ran to Mrs. Rose's room and, without hesitation, hugged her. Mrs. Rose, with incredible effort, murmured a few words. It wasn't a natural heart attack. My son caused it. Help me. After that, she fell asleep again. Julia did not fully understand those words and decided to spend the afternoon and night by Mrs. Rose's side, taking care of her. The next day, to everyone's surprise, Mrs. Rose opened her eyes. But this time, without saying anything. It was a moment of joy and relief. Dr. Samuel assured that she would remain hospitalized for 2 more weeks and undergo angioplasty. When Martin, Mrs. Rose's son, learned that she had survived, he appeared visibly irritated but determined to change the situation. He planned a surprise for her when she returned home. Mrs. Rose, after weeks of recovery, was still fragile and had memory problems. Martin, seeing an opportunity in this, decided to act. Mom, what do you think about taking a trip to the city center next week? He suggested, hiding his true intentions. We'll go by bus. It will be an adventure. The lady, somewhat forgetful, accepted with a smile. Meanwhile, Julia visited Mrs. Rose every night, always worried. She even invited the lady to stay at her house, but Mrs. Rose, attached to her home, refused. Then came Tuesday, the appointed day for the trip. Martin prepared everything carefully. He packed his mother's medicines in a bag and took her to the bus stop. You'll love it, Mom, he said, with a laugh that hid his true purpose. On the bus, Martin executed his cruel plan. He left Mrs. Rose in a distant place, alone and helpless. Furthermore, he took the lady's bank card and, as if that wasn't enough, sold her house, keeping all the money for himself and the woman who helped him plan this terrible act. When Julia went to visit Mrs. Rose the next night, a new owner opened the door. I don't know any Rose, he said. This house is mine now. I bought it. Julia, desperate, looked for Martin, but he had disappeared. Then, she remembered Mrs. Rose's words upon waking and started putting the pieces of the puzzle together. She also recalled that Martin had requested the doctor to disconnect the machines when Mrs. Rose began to show her first signs of improvement. Realizing that Martin could be behind all this, Julia immediately called the police, informing them about Mrs. Rose's disappearance and the possible attempted murder that Martin had committed against his own mother. Shortly after, she received Mrs. Rose's test results, confirming the poisoning, which further increased her suspicions against Martin. The doctors had taken time to discover it, as the poison used was difficult to detect. That same night, Julia's heart was filled with pain and anguish. She wanted to help in the search to find Mrs. Rose. However, the cancer she was fighting against did not give her a break, and she had to be hospitalized. Julia arrived at the hospital carrying a mix of hope and apprehension. Upon entering the emergency room, her eyes widened in surprise. There was Dr. Samuel, the same doctor who had taken care of Mrs. Rose. He greeted Julia with a kind smile, but his eyes revealed the seriousness of the situation. "Julia, you have lost a lot of weight. Also, have you felt full after eating?" he asked. Julia shook her head. "No, doctor. But the oncologist said that each person reacts differently to cancer." "That's true," agreed Dr. Samuel. "And your tests show signs of stomach cancer. But tell me, what else have you felt?" Julia sighed with the weight of reality on her shoulders. "Stomach pain and bleeding, doctor." "I understand," he said, noting something in his notebook. "We will do some additional tests." "Julia, I will explain each one of them patiently," the doctor detailed. "First, we will do an upper digestive endoscopy. This involves a flexible tube with a camera that we pass through the throat to the stomach to observe and, if necessary, collect samples for biopsy." Julia nodded, trying to absorb all the information. "Then, we will have a computed tomography scan and an MRI. These imaging tests will help us understand the size and location of the cancer. Additionally, we will do an abdominal ultrasound to check if the cancer has spread to other organs." Julia took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Finally, blood tests. They cannot diagnose stomach cancer on their own, but they provide important information about your overall health and possible markers associated with cancer. In some cases, we might need a laparoscopic biopsy to get a clearer view." At that moment, a faint flame of hope ignited in Julia's heart. She felt genuinely touched by Dr. Samuel's concern, something she had lacked for a long time. Determined, she underwent all the necessary tests, anxiously awaiting the results. While she rested and received 4 fluids, her husband Leo didn't even bother to visit her. He only called to say he was worried and loved her. Julia, however, knew well his lies and paid no attention to his empty words. The hours passed slowly until finally, at 4 p.m., Dr. Samuel appeared with the results. He entered the room with an euphoric smile and gave Julia a warm hug. "We have 2 news," he began. "One very good and one a bit concerning. Which one do you want to hear first?" "Maybe the good one," Julia replied, a mix of fear and hope in her voice. "The good news," said the doctor with a relieved smile, "is that you do not have cancer, as I suspected. But the concerning news is that you have been poisoned. Someone, just like in Mrs. Rose's case, was trying to kill you with a very strong poison. By a twist of fate, your case is similar to hers, but you were very lucky." Hearing this, Leo came to Julia's mind. She had no doubt it was him. Now, with reports and tests in hand, she could put him behind bars, and she would do the same with Martin, Mrs. Rose's son, whom she believed to be a murderer. When Dr. Samuel came to visit her again, Julia asked him to inform Leo that she would be hospitalized for a chemotherapy session. The doctor nodded, signaling his approval of her plan. "You are officially discharged," he said. "Do what you need to do. But before you go, would you like to have lunch with me?" Blushing, Julia smiled shyly at Dr. Samuel. "With pleasure," she said, her trembling voice revealing a deeper emotion. "Thank you for saving my life twice. First by saving Mrs. Rose, whom I consider a mother, and now by saving me." The doctor returned the smile. "You're welcome, Julia. I was just doing my job." "Then it's settled. We will meet at the downtown restaurant." As agreed, Dr. Samuel called Leo, informing him about the supposed complications in Julia's cancer and the need for chemotherapy. Leo's barely concealed joy on the phone was evident, but he was far from imagining what was really happening. The next day, after leaving the hospital, Julia checked into a hotel room. At night, she prepared meticulously for the dinner with Dr. Samuel. Dressed in an elegant red dress and with her hair braided, she was simply stunning. As she got ready, Julia realized she was falling in love with the doctor, and something inside her told her the feeling was mutual. The dinner was magical. Throughout the night, Samuel couldn't stop expressing his admiration. "You look wonderful tonight, Julia. And to be honest, I would love for you to be the mother of my children." Julia, captivated by the doctor's audacity and charm, couldn't resist and kissed him passionately, accepting his unexpected proposal. After dinner, they went to his house, where they lived a night of intense passion, marking the beginning of a great love. The next morning, Dr. Samuel, on his day off, prepared a special breakfast for Julia and invited her to visit his country house. Julia accepted, but emphasized the importance of resolving the situation with Leo and Martin, as well as finding Mrs. Rose. Samuel supported her, taking her to the best lawyer in the city. Together, they handed over the tests and evidence to the expert, starting a process of separation and moral damages against the two charlatans. As the case progressed, Julia and Dr. Samuel also brought to light Martin's crimes, exposing how he took advantage of his mother's assets, Mrs. Rose. Days passed, and Leo received a summons to appear in court, as did Martin. However, Martin remained missing, leaving a trail of mystery. In court, Julia was armed with irrefutable evidence. Leo's lawyer fought, but the evidence against his client was overwhelming. As a result, Leo was sentenced to 40 years in prison and ordered to pay a large sum in moral damages. Without financial resources, his parents were held responsible, especially for having knowledge of their son's illicit relationship with the maid and for having unfairly dismissed Mrs. Rose. With Martin still on the run, the judge issued an announcement requesting information about his whereabouts. A week later, with the case still pending, Samuel and Julia decided to leave the city and went to the doctor's country house. Upon arriving, they were greeted by a cook and a cleaner. Julia, exploring the house, entered the kitchen and, to her surprise, found Mrs. Rose. In a moment of shocking revelation, she discovered that the lady had lost her memory. Over time, Mrs. Rose's fragmented memories began to return. Among these memories, she detailed everything Martin had done to her. Determined to seek justice, Julia and Samuel hired a private detective. It didn't take long to locate Martin in another state and bring him to trial. In court, Martin confessed his struggle with schizophrenia, but it did little to mitigate his sentence. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. In a moment of clarity and repentance, he admitted all his crimes before being taken to a maximum security prison. 2 years after these tumultuous events, Julia and Samuel's life found a new chapter of happiness. They married in an intimate and cozy ceremony, and soon 2 children, William and Renata, arrived. Mrs. Rose, now more recovered, moved in with them at the country house, enjoying every second with those who truly loved her. She loved cooking for the family, filling the house with aromas and laughter. In a gesture of kindness and compassion, Julia and Samuel also opened their home to Martin's children. After all they had faced, these children found a safe and loving home, full of affection and new possibilities. Together, they formed a united family, marked not only by the adversities of the past but also by the strength of love, resilience, and forgiveness. If you were in Mrs. Rose's place, overhearing the terrible conversation between her son and the unknown woman, what would you do? Would you tell the police everything, even if he is your son, or would you try to find another solution? Leave your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss new exciting stories. Also, these stories on your screen can touch your heart. Watch and be happy. See you next time.